The following video contains some graphic content. Viewer discretion is advised.
You are now watching SpyFox Television.
By the late 80s, when Jeffrey Dahmer began stalking the gay nightclubs of Milwaukee, the term serial murderer was a relatively young topic of research. Coined by FBI agent Robert Kessler in the 1970s, Agent Kessler and his colleagues practically wrote the very short book on this type of behavioral science. By 1991, the same year Yours and My Favorite Rock album was released, and the same year Jeff Dahmer was finally arrested, everyone from behavioral scientists to clinical psychologists to everyday regular people were wondering the same thing. Are serial killers born, or are serial killers created? That some unfortunate, tiny fraction of our population will be cursed at birth with a genetic propensity to violence that will predetermine their actions later in life? Or does one's environment, under the right, or maybe I should say under the wrong circumstances, create a serial killer? This debate rages on among the behavioral science community. As for me, and full disclaimer here, I am of no background for anyone to be taking my word for it. I can only speculate and give you my opinion, but personally I believe that both mental illness and environment combined are prerequisites to create a serial killer's compulsions. Now, clearly I don't have a definitive answer on whether or not a serial killer is born or created, or maybe a combination of both. But what I'd like to do in this video is explore some of these compulsions that serial killers often talk about after being caught. And the best way to thoroughly explain my argument is to compare serial killers. For this purpose, I have chosen John Wayne Gacy. Gacy and Dahmer operated around the same time. They both chose male victims. They both often drugged and or handcuffed their victims in order to gain control over them, thus gaining sexual gratification out of that control. They were also both closet homosexuals who came from families that would not agree with that type of lifestyle. Hell, they even both died in prison the same year, 1994. Other than that, there are numerous differences. Dahmer immediately admitted all of his crimes, apologized, and asked for forgiveness, while Gacy went to his grave denying that he had ever laid a finger on any boy. Dahmer asked for the electric chair, while Gacy petitioned the court over and over again to grant him immunity from the death penalty. Ultimately, Dahmer would be savagely, and some might say, including me, justly, beaten to death with a barbell, while Gacy received the quick and painless death that Dahmer could only wish for. Gacy's last words being, "You can all kiss my ass." Gacy's family would do the right thing by donating his brain to science in the hopes that researchers could discover some abnormality, if even only a tumor, to explain some of his behavior while here on Earth. And yet no abnormality could be found. John Wayne Gacy's brain functioned as normally as yours or my own. However, Gacy did have a terribly abusive father. But then again, how many children growing up post-World War II and the Korean War didn't have an abusive father who believed in harsh punishments for naughty boys? Gacy and Dahmer's generations were raised by the type of men who were forcibly taken from their homes, stripped of their identities, trained in the art of hand-to-hand combat, and then dropped out of planes and helicopters on a foreign land where everything moving was trying to kill them. Even the very air they were breathing was full of foreign bacteria and viruses. These were boys fresh out of high school who just went from Friday night football games, high school dances, and parks at Lover's Lane to running through demolished city streets and jungles, fearing that any second they might eat a bullet, enough to damage anyone's psyche. The ones who were skillful enough or lucky enough to survive were then brought back home, where they were discharged from military service, abandoned by their government, and expected to just proceed with their lives. At this point in history, proceeding with your life meant finding a girl your mother liked enough for you to marry, getting her pregnant, raising her children. And very few of those children raised by this generation of men did not feel the wrong end of a belt on their backsides. How many of you felt the wrong end of a belt when you were a child? I surely know I did. This was a tough generation, far from the parenting style of today. There are behavioral scientists today who believe that that generation of men raising their children in such a harsh, cruel way is what has led to the rise of serial killers within our nation. This isn't my idea. It comes from experts. I'm not sure if I agree with it or not. I'm sure that there are plenty of you out there right now thinking, my father's a veteran, my grandfather's a veteran, and they were the most wonderful man on earth to me. This is just one of many ideas. Others attribute the national highway system, which is a fairly new invention. A person can kill someone and dump their body 1,000 miles away in one day. Although I understand that theory, I do not agree with it. Here's what's so interesting. I believe it's possible that the interstate and highway system could be responsible for a rise in murder, but not serial murder. For example, that distance may give someone just enough courage to push them over the edge and get rid of somebody close to them and try to take their life insurance. I get that, but most serial killers would often dump the bodies either close to home so they could go and revisit the corpse, sometimes desecrating the corpse, sometimes engaging in necrophilia. When it comes to Dahmer and Gacy, they actually like to keep the corpses with them in their homes. Gacy burying 33 boys under his home and in his yard. Dahmer preserving bones, preserving organs. 2 different hearts were found in his freezer, 5 heads, muscles from the biceps of his victims, and even the genitalia. Dahmer would go on to say after he murdered his first victim, Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker, and we will get into Dahmer's full story. After burying the remains, he waited a couple weeks, he dug them up, he pared the flesh, and then took the bones, heated them up in the oven, because as he said, they were wet and squishy on the inside. He needed to heat them up in an oven to dry them out, and then he proceeded to smash them with a sledgehammer, spreading the remains all around his house. When asked why he did this, he didn't say to destroy the evidence. He said, because I wanted him all around me. He had this need, this compulsion for people to not leave him. And he felt as though the only way he could get people to not leave him was to kill them and keep them. We will soon get into Jeffrey Dahmer's early childhood, and you will very easily be able to understand where this fear of abandonment comes from. Another similarity of Gacy and Dahmer. Some of the males that they would invite into their home, they would not kill. Others, they would. It depended on how attracted they were to that particular person. The more attractive you are, the more likely you're going to die, so they can keep you. At any rate, let's get back to the argument at hand. Creation versus environment. We know that Gacy's brain was normal, but he was abused by his father. This would lead any rational person to conclude Gacy was a product of his environment. There are things that happened to him in his life that made him become the monster he became. However, I disagree. Before we get to Dahmer and talk about his background and his brain, I would like to argue, in my unprofessional opinion, whoever said that someone has to have a damaged brain or somehow different brain to engage in antisocial behavior. After all, statistics tell us that a large part of our population are narcissists. Another part of our population, sociopaths. Is it not possible for a brain to fully function and still be operating abnormally? Scientists, researchers, doctors, clinical psychologists have listed numerous mental illnesses that any one of us could suffer from and still have a fully functional brain. On the other hand, there is still so much we don't know about the human brain and genetics. Perhaps some switch gets flipped in these serial killers that does not get flipped within all of us. Hopefully someday we will be able to predetermine a person's later actions and do something about it beforehand to help stop them from these atrocious kinds of acts. But as for right now, we are just left to speculate. One thing I want you to think about and speculate on yourself is something Dahmer would later describe. After he was caught, he described his atrocious acts, his need to dominate and control, his need to take the life of his victim and then cut them open and examine their innards, to even go as far as preserving their remains. He describes all those acts as compulsions. Well, what's a compulsion? Hey guys, do you remember what it's like to be a young man in your early 20s? What's your compulsion? When your hormones are going crazy and all you can think about is girls. It's a compulsion. It drives you. I gotta get a girlfriend. I gotta get a date. Imagine if instead of procreating, being intimate with a woman, your compulsion was that strong to kill someone. How long could you go without performing that act? It would be the same as a young man remaining abstinent. And for all we know, it could be even stronger than that. It could be even stronger than a young person's hormones. You know what I mean? So when you think about it in that aspect, it's like, wow. Or maybe another comparison would be for you smokers. How difficult would it be for you to right now put out the cigarette, throw away the cigarettes, and never touch them again, cold turkey? You know, it's like, how long could you go without smoking that cigarette? That's the way Jeffrey Dahmer would later describe. There were compulsions that tempted him, and he did not possess the willpower to restrain himself. And as sick as this sounds, I warned you, viewer discretion advised. If you're comparing a compulsion to kill someone as the same as the compulsion to procreate in life, there are things you can do to help rid yourself, at least temporarily, of the temptation to procreate, right? To be intimate with someone. You can masturbate, right? There are other things you can do that help you get rid of those thoughts. Well, think about Jeffrey Dahmer taking these animals and dissecting them and playing with the bones and squishing the guts in his hands. Maybe to him, that was like masturbation, right? And it helped for a certain period of time, but then it got to the point where it's like, well, doing this isn't good enough. I need the real thing. When you think about it that way, it's even scarier. As far as we know, our main purpose for being alive is to create more life. It's to procreate. That's our main objective of every single person's life on this earth. So imagine when a person's psyche gets so twisted that they start to feel sexual gratification from extreme violence. That's what we need to understand. We need to understand what causes that. How is their brain making that connection? I mean, how many of you can right now say, you know what, I'm just going to go the rest of my life without having sex? And don't take me the wrong way. I'm not making excuses for this guy. He was a terrible human being. He deserved what he got. I'm just trying to understand what would make a person do the things he did. We will never know whether or not his brain held any of the clues to his behavior because his father would not allow his body to be used for such a forward-thinking study. You see, Jeffrey Dahmer's wishes were he be cremated upon death. And even though it is quite possible that Jeffrey Dahmer abused and desecrated more corpses than any other human being to walk this earth, somehow Lionel Dahmer, Jeff's father, felt as though his son's wishes for his own body should be respected, even in the face of a possible scientific breakthrough. Lionel Dahmer would not allow his son's brain to be studied by scientists and researchers, and therefore we will never know if he had any abnormalities. Although there are unpleasant aspects of Jeffrey's childhood in which we will discuss in this video, there are none that would certainly point to his behavior later in life. If I'm being completely honest with you, Jeffrey Dahmer had a much more pleasant home life in his childhood than this narrator, and you don't see me on the nightly news with 50-gallon barrels rolling out of my home. However, I would argue that although his father, by all accounts, did not abuse him physically or sexually, what his father did do, in my opinion, can be just as detrimental to a young person's development as any old regular abuse can be, and that is, his father was an enabler. We all strive for a happy medium, or we should be. At one end of the spectrum, you have the obvious neglect and abuse. This is the end of the spectrum that all child counselors concentrate on and give all their attention to. It's what you can see. Is the child malnourished? Does the child have bruises and scratches? Is the child timid? The other end of the spectrum that cannot be seen, we seldom talk about, and that is a complete lack of structure and discipline. It is every parent's duty to raise a child that is able to function as an adult responsibly, and to teach them how to build long-term relationships with people, how to give and receive love, how to nurture and be nurtured. A parent cannot simply provide food, clothing, and shelter and then step away and let the child run wild. A parent who ignores their child, lets them do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it, and rewards them when they should have received punishment, which is exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer's father did to him. He knew that the mother wasn't well in the head, and he just left his child to live inside his own head. If you do not teach your child how to have a relationship with other people, how to have long-term friendships, you are neglecting them. You are not preparing them for adulthood. When a young man is allowed to run wild, left to his own devices, well, I would call this neglect. After all, failure reflects leadership. My point is this: there are many different types of abuse, and not all abuse manifests itself physically. Let's see what kind of abuse Jeffrey Dahmer endured within his childhood. When Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960, his blonde-haired mother from Norwegian descent, Joyce Dahmer, worked as a teletype machinist instructor, while his father attended classes at the private Catholic College of Marquette University. Although his mother was known to be a tense person, quick to pick an argument with family and neighbors alike, and often attention-seeking, most close relatives recall that Jeffrey was often doted upon by both parents as a baby. But by the time Jeff entered grade school, his father was busy with graduate studies that kept him away from home for long hours. Left to her own devices without the attention she wanted from her husband, Joyce developed severe hypochondria. Now, hypochondria is a mental disorder in which the sufferer believes that she or he are experiencing something wrong with their health when in fact, there's probably nothing wrong with them. Often these terrible thoughts will become an obsession. They're often concentrated toward either the gastrointestinal part of the body or the heart. In Joyce's case, she would believe she had multiple diseases. Hypochondriacs are often also pathological liars who truly believe the lies they tell their friends and family. It is very difficult to reason with a pathological liar. They feel justified in their argument, making themselves believe they are doing you no wrong. The hypochondria kept Joyce in bed, leading to depression. When Lionel was home, Joyce demanded his constant attentiveness to her needs, resulting in Jeffrey being ignored quite often. Later, Lionel would say he believed Joyce to be caring for Jeffrey while he was gone, so it made sense that he would care for her while he was at home, since she was spending her days caring for Jeffrey. Turned out, neither parent was spending time nurturing young Jeffrey. Naturally, over time, Lionel would discover Joyce's neglect of their son. He even sought professional counseling through a friend. The common belief at the time was, happy wife, happy life. so Lionel spent countless hours trying to make his wife happy in the hopes that she would resume her motherly duties. This approach did not work, resulting in Jeffrey later recalling extreme tension within the household and an unsure feeling of solidity in the family. In other words, he felt as though he were living with strangers who did not want to be with him or be with each other. At school, one teacher even said she detected early signs of abandonment. Jeffrey was developing into a very timid boy. However, at this time in elementary school, he did have a small group of friends, so alarm bells were not ringing yet. At the age of 4, Jeffrey witnessed Lionel removing a dead animal from underneath the family's home. Jeffrey picked up the dried bones over and over, throwing them into a small metal bucket. Lionel, his father, would later recall, Jeff seemed oddly thrilled with the sounds the bones made. He even referred to them as his fiddlesticks. In 1966, at 6 years old, Jeffrey's mother became pregnant again. The family had moved to Doylestown, Ohio, and Lionel had got a job as an analytic chemist in nearby Akron, Ohio. During her pregnancy, Joyce Dahmer's hypochondria became even worse. Joyce believed that she was suffering through multiple ailments, insisting that doctors medicate her. Lionel became so concerned he even asked the doctor to stop prescribing so many different pills to his wife, but Joyce continued to abuse whatever she could get her hands on, mainly Equinel, an early variant of Xanax, a barbiturate. As recently as 2020, Lionel Dahmer would give an interview where he says that there actually was something wrong with Joyce, but the doctors never figured it out. He said that she would get seizure-like symptoms. Her jaw would seize. She would get a little foam in the side of her mouth. She never passed out. She never fully went into seizure. They really couldn't figure it out. For many years, he said that it was all in her head. And then in 2020, he says, quite possibly, there really was something wrong with her. Regardless, Joyce believed that there was way more wrong with her than what there actually was, and it would lead to mental health issues. Lionel and Joyce would give Jeffrey the privilege of naming his younger brother. He chooses the name David. David Dahmer would later change his name and live his life in secrecy. To this day, he has not broken his silence, and no one knows what his name is. Still, as much as Lionel was gone and as distant as Joyce was, Sundays were reserved for the family. This is the one day a week that Lionel Dahmer would devote himself to family. In an interview, Lionel Dahmer would recount somewhat of a family tradition where on Sunday mornings they would wake up early and him and Jeff would walk to a local farm where they would purchase eggs, and then they would come back and make eggs and pancakes and bacon, and the whole family would hang out a little bit for that one day a week. Just like today's social media, where we put on our best smile and make everybody else believe that our lives are perfect, back then, it was even easier to conceal troubles within the family. The only time anyone else got a glimpse of the family is if they were in public or if you see their home videos. Naturally, they put on their best smile and they play with their kids, and it seems as though this is the life. This is how it is every day, but Lionel himself even admitted the only time I ever really paid attention to my family was on Sundays. Lionel does say that around 6 years old, he began to notice that Dahmer was a shy kid. However, he had been a shy kid too, and therefore, he didn't think much of it at the time. Within home footage, Lionel appears to be a very proud father, carrying Jeff around on his shoulders. And interesting, Dahmer took a liking to lifting weights at a very young age. It would be something that he would make a habit of throughout his entire life. He even ended up being murdered himself in a weight room. I do wonder if Dahmer continued lifting weights throughout his adulthood out of habit, or possibly he did it so he could overpower his victims. Dahmer's not a muscular, bulky guy, but he was a very toned, wiry guy. You can bend wire, but you can't break it. Less than 2 years later, in 1968, the Dahmer family would move to Bath Township in Summit County, Ohio. This would become the family home where Jeffrey would spend the remainder of his youth. The house sat on nearly 2 acres of woods. Out back was a shack that over the next several years Dahmer would use to collect carcasses and store them in. It began with normal things that any curious kid who is into science and biology might find interesting, like dragonflies and moths. And when he found them, dead chipmunks and squirrels too. Being a chemist, Lionel felt the fascination healthy at this time, and even brought home some formaldehyde in which he would use to teach Jeffrey how to dissect and preserve remains. Soon, Jeffrey's newfound hobby turned into an obsession, going as far as to preserve remains and then hide them all around the wooded areas surrounding the Dahmers' home. During a family dinner, Jeff asked his father what would happen if they took the chicken bones out and soaked them in bleach. Lionel, obviously believing this was just another scientific inquiry, taught his son how to safely bleach and preserve the bones. It is at this point in time that Dahmer would begin building makeshift altars, burying the bones he did not find attractive, and often presenting the skulls atop rudimentary wooden crosses. Jeff developed into quite the little scavenger around town, picking up roadkill for his homemade shrines. Another interesting detail about Jeffrey Dahmer's young life: on more than one occasion, his mother, Joyce, had pulled knives on his father, Lionel. Perhaps this could give the young man, who looks up to Mother as God, the impression that it's okay to become violent once you can't take any more, once you can't handle any more stress. Well, Mom does it, so it can't be that bad. Ladies and gentlemen, episode 2 is going to be much more extreme, much more graphic. It's probably going to be demonetized because of the images I have to show. If you have a squeamish stomach, if you don't like this sort of thing, you might not want to watch it. You might want to skip it. We will get into his high school and college days, Jeffrey Dahmer's stint in the army, and of course, the victims at his grandmother's house and the victims in Milwaukee. Again, much more graphic in episode 2. I would love to have your feedback on Jeffrey Dahmer's early life. Do you think it was Mom's hypochondria, her pathological lying, she's getting violent with Dad, pulling knives? Dad is always away from home while Mom lays in bed ignoring her children, tranked out on pills. I didn't even mention the fact that his mother would try to commit suicide so many times that the father would not even care. He would just say, "Oh, that's just Joyce. She's just trying to get attention." Is it a combination of everything plus mental illness? What do you think? What do you have to add to this picture of Jeffrey Dahmer's early life? Lionel Dahmer has admitted that he would purposely stay away from home. He could have spent more time with his family, and he chose to stay at work at his laboratory. He liked that better than being a dad at home. This is essentially a kid who raised himself. Yes, he was fortunate in the fact that he was raised within an upper middle class home where he could get anything he wanted, but as far as attention went, he was basically left to his own devices to live in his own mind. And for someone like Jeffrey Dahmer, obviously that was not a good thing. Again, much more graphic in the next episode. There's going to be some pretty disturbing imagery in the next episode. Bye-bye.